Hello, everyone. My name is David Singh, and I'm a PhD student from the University of East Anglia and University of Copenhagen. I am really pleased to present my research today on the extraction of the Indian green gold, dispossession and domination, a war for space in the name of renewables. And first of all, I would like to briefly introduce my research topic. So renewable energies are presented as the modern pathway for sustainable development and the solution to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel energy. And that's why renewables are globally promoted by a diversity of actors. They are building a consensus around the need for the energy transition and a low carbon society that is compatible with the environment. And this phenomenon is particularly prevalent in India, where we have several national missions on solar and wind that have been implemented all around the country, and the ultra mega power project of both solar panels and wind farms are being developed. They are integrated within the liberalized framework of the Indian power sector, and they are mainly developed under public and private partnership. But these projects are well connected to global financial capital and international mechanisms of governance, but they are also embedded in specific local and spatial contexts. Indeed, we see that they follow a path of resource extraction, where natural services like sunlight and wind are being commodified, and where land is enclosed. They result also in new forms of spatiality and territories, in renewed social and land controls mediated by power brokers. They generate dispossession and inclusion, but also create important resistance movement and new political outcomes for subordinate communities. Renewable public goods are also subjected to certain knowledge construction, to certain imaginaries and representation. And they are allegedly abundant, infinite, and situated on empty lands in remote rural areas. And these constructions around renewables are associated with energy sovereignty, security issues, colonial representations of development. And therefore, they reveal a new resource governance and a territorialization process where both power and wealth work together to extract a new green gold. And here the question of green gold is following the tradition of coal described as black gold or oil described as liquid gold, but the choice of a metaphorical prefix here rather than a descriptive one refers to the political construction behind renewables. And so the main aim of this research is to investigate the extraction process of renewables in India from the perspective of accumulation by dispossession, intermediation, the aspect of frontier making and territorialization dynamic, and the question of resistance and political reactions. And the overarching research question guiding this research, this investigation, is how is large-scale renewable extraction redefining both resource governance and subordinate political agency. So I would like to start first with a brief critical review of the available literature on which I am relying. Then I would like to move on the methods and the case study context on which I've been doing my scoping field work. And then I will move on the analytical framework and the early findings coming from the field. So first of all, I'm relying on three bodies of literature coming from energy geography, political ecology, governance, and resistance studies. And therefore, the first set of literature is coming from the sociopolitics of energy extraction, and partly how is renewable energy situated within important debates coming from the political ecology literature and this question of extraction. How is resource extraction defined? And defined as the activity of extracting materials from territories of the earth and converting them into value. But we see that this definition focuses mainly on the physical removal process that has been traditionally linked to mine and mining projects. So how do we broaden and include renewables in this definition? Then renewables are also falling into the larger pattern of resource commodification and how new natural elements like wind and sunlight are being commodified, valuable, have been framed as valuable green gold, object of speculation, exchange, instruments of profits. And then resource extraction is also, in most cases, associated to resource enclosure and dispossession. And this refers to the growing literature on the global land grab. But nonetheless, these valuable concepts on commodification, on accumulation, and dispossession in extractive contexts have not sufficiently looked at the specificity of renewables, and particularly how the biophysical features and the geographical spread specific to wind and solar create different extraction stories. Then the second body of literature is coming from the Foucauldian and governance studies, and how knowledge construction and how socio-technical imaginaries around energy are influencing the set of possibilities and policies in favor of privatized governance, closed state business relationship, and extraterritorial. And indeed, we know that energy systems are politically constructed. They are associated to specific resource construction discourses, so knowledge production about resource management, about resource materiality and availability. And as reporting in this emerging literature, we see that renewables seems to be producing a new energy system where we have an important discourse of greenness, cleanness, and a nationalist tone. And this construction around renewables are influencing the set of policies in favor of privatized governance of renewable. And indeed, we see that renewable energy extraction is situated within the neoliberal governance of power sector in India that has been liberalized in the 90s, but it advances also new characteristics that have been highlighted in the literature on low carbon, on low carbon governance, for example. And indeed, we see that renewable are following almost completely privatized development path. And this specific neoliberal governance and government of resources, create an extraction that is associated mostly in the literature to meta infrastructures, to extra statecraft and extraterritoriality, where extractive spaces are described as enclaved, as disconnected territories, and where extraction is following a punctuated and a discontinuous geography. But we see that also this literature, this governance literature, is mostly engaging with global mechanisms, with national state business relations and privatized governance, and does not really investigate how certain problematization, how certain imaginaries and territorial regulations are actually deployed and mobilized to control and govern new resources and territory. Then the last bit of literature is coming from the debates on social struggles and resistance movement, and particularly the role of conflicts in shaping political outcomes. So first, academics have pointed out that resisting destructive and dispossessing conservation, mining, or even renewable is associated with an ongoing process of agrarian historical struggles re-emerging through current environmental issues. And indeed, ecological issues, have been described as a tool to contest power structures, to deepen local democracy and empower local indigenous identities. But on the other hand, at the same time, resistance movements are also reproducing and reinforcing existing power structures. And this can lead, in some instances, to passive acquiescence and inaction, because we know that resource extraction is placed within structured and hierarchical agrarian and rural economies. So beyond this debate around the existence or the absence of resistance movement and the capacities to contest or consolidate socio-political hierarchies, there's still much to be investigated on what triggers resistance or acquiescence and what shapes certain forms of political reactions and not others. So I would like now to move briefly on the methods and the case study on which I'm relying. So this study focuses on the case of Gujarat because it is often presented in the literature as a case in point of economic and land policies liberalization, as well as a very strong business friendly policies and business friendly state. And this research looks more precisely at the district of Kutch, situated here in this area, that have shifted from being the margin of Gujarat towards a new resource frontier and space for capital accumulation, particularly since 2001 and the earthquake, where the district has been identified as a rich windy state and therefore framed as a wind corridor, and where thousands of windmill projects have been developed by established companies for more than 15 years. And so I conducted here a scoping field visit in February of 3 weeks. So this is part of my doctoral research plan, and I will be doing a full year on the field starting from September. So I'm mentioning this to explain that it's for now a work in progress, and that I will only show early findings. But still, I organized my study in two areas. So first, I went to the coastal area around Manvi. And then I shifted to Nakatrana, which is more a mainland area. And I decided to look at different time-scale projects, both projects established 15 years ago, also under construction. I've decided to look at two geographical zones. We have coastal area, we have mainland area, and also I've tried to have two different socioeconomic composition. Particularly has Nakatrana, this area around Bhuj, it has an important land owning Dalit community, an organized Dalit community, and organized Dalit organization. And so now, since I've present my methods and the scoping fieldwork, I would like to present the early findings that have came from the field, and particularly how they are linked to my analytical framework, and how do I approach this aspect of dispossession and domination in regard to renewable extraction in this area. So first of all, I'm looking at the development of wind power and the wind extraction in Kutch as within the resource frontier making and the territorialization framework, and particularly how is resource extraction embedded in a set of governance instruments such as problematization, knowledge production, regulation, and subject identification, and how do these governance instruments then justify and enforce ways of ruling new resources, spaces, and population. And particularly the concept developed by Rasmussen and Lund is particularly relevant, as they explain that when new resources are discovered, there is actually an overlapping cyclical dynamic of both frontier making and then territorialization that takes place. And indeed, the resource frontier dynamic refers first to the breaking down of existing social, institutional, and social orders, and particularly the destruction of previous property regimes, of previous land uses and claims and rights and livelihoods. And therefore, in Kutch, we see that traditional pastoral practices, because it's an area where we have important pastoral communities. So the traditional pastoral practices in Kutch have been constantly denied by policymakers when they plot public lands to companies, and particularly to wind companies. And this process of resource making is grounded in neocolonial and solid neocolonial subject identification, where we see that original inhabitants of Kutch are being described as less than legal subjects, less than legal citizens, with little capacity to exert right because of the apparent backwardness or primitiveness of their activities, particularly pastoral activities, and their land are being described as empty waste. But then we have a reverse process, a reverse dynamic, which is the territorialization, and which is about the building of new institutional orders. And particularly, the territorialization involves a series of governmental techniques where new territorial rules, new property regimes and laws are being established and implemented. But then, to govern and control these new frontier spaces and territories where new resources have been discovered, there is a need to deploy and mobilize a set of concrete instruments, a set of concrete governance instruments. And I would like here to focus only on one of them that was really prevalent during my field visit, which is the question of mapping procedures, mapping resources, cartographies, zoning space, and territorial organization. And first, the territorial organization of a wind farm is truly interesting and unique because, contrary to solar power plants or even mining projects that are situated at one precise and single delimited location, the geography of wind farm is much more diffuse, much more dispersed over a large tract of land. And a wind farm, a wind project can be up to 20 or 30 kilometers. So it's a completely different scale. And then concerning the proper mapping resource mapping, we know that maps are not neutral representation of an objective reality, but they are always political choices, legitimizing certain resource uses while marginalizing others. And regarding the mapping of wind resources and the wind mapping assessment, it is surely technical, but also highly political. When they decide to locate a particular wind mine in a village, it equally depends on the quantity of wind received in the area than the nature of the land. Is it an agricultural land? Is it a grazing land? Is it a wasteland? Its ownership, is it public or private? And the relative cost to acquire it. So from what I was able to see is that the wind companies have dedicated land teams, and these land teams first collect available data on land titles and land records from tax officers, from local state, from land revenue services, but they also develop their own micro sightings, their own surveys on the ground. They visit the village to identify potential seizable land. But these governance instruments here that I've been discussing briefly, they are always mediated and always fixed, endorsed on the ground by a diversity of local actors. And here, my research is also quite interested in the issue of mediation and patronage relation within the renewable extraction in Kutch, and particularly how the governance instruments that I discussed earlier, like the territorial rules and regulation, how are they reshaped, reinterpreted when they hit the ground reality. And indeed, this refers to the question of brokers, of local bureaucrats, of companies' representative, and how they mediate and fix resource extraction. And indeed, brokers are quite important in the resource extraction project. They facilitate the implementation of resource extractors, the control of a space, and company representative confirmed to me several times that they are relying on powerful communities, on powerful castes, on so-called big men to acquire land, to make the peace, to buy the peace with the villagers, to conduct the non-skilled work. So we have two levels of brokering activities here. We have the village level, where brokers are actually land brokers fulfill a critical social role because the urban engineers, the company managers do not belong to the rural economy, and therefore they create this link and they also provide a trust in the landings. And so when village brokers are aware that companies look for land in a specific area, they can successfully mobilize their connection with local state, with local land administrators and tax officers, mobilize their network, their family network, their village network, their caste network, and also their knowledge about land market and land value to acquire land from private owners and then sell it to the companies. But then at the district level, when it comes to more big land deals and important construction work, we have a different type, a different nature of brokers and contractors that advance their own agenda, their own control strategies, because they also belong most often to they're affiliated to political parties, to mafia-like networks. And I was mentioned several times that in the big land deals, the local politicians, local MPs, local retired army officers were always involved in this process. But both levels of brokering activities actually reinforce land commodification, participate to the expansion of patronage relation, corruption networks in the rural economy because they use the power of money to dissolve existing solidarities, but also create new financial expectations from villages. But they also act as powerful agents, maintaining caste dominance of landlords over tenants and laborers. But this power relation and this domination experiences created by green extraction also generate an important large repertoire of resistance and contestation. And particularly, I'm looking at the resistance as a reaction to situation of domination, as an oppositional relation to power. And therefore, it is interesting to see what kind of resistance practices and discourses emerge from what kind of power and domination situation. And I rely here on Scott's conception of domination that I try to apply to my case, and particularly how is the extraction of renewable in Kutch associated to ideological domination with the strengthening of caste structure, the statist domination with the use of excessive violent and humiliating means of persuasion, and a final material domination with the dispossession of land and the marginalization of rural livelihoods. So given this range of power relation and experiences of domination, we can acknowledge that the reaction to them are equally diverse and multiple. And indeed, I witnessed completely different ways of expressing contestation and resistance. And in the case of Nakatrana, situated in the main land area, where I visited mainly wind project under construction, the open resistance to renewable here was prevalent, public and organized resistance, because also of the specific socio-economic composition of this area. And over there, Dalit organizations are leading the important resistance movement to renewables, using traditional tools of mobilization like protest, rallies, petition, hunger strikes. And over there, the environmental concern and the impact caused by wind power extraction is a central and powerful mobilization factor, particularly for pastoral communities that rely on ecosystem services, on common and free natural resources for their livelihood. And so in these resistant discourses and practices, I saw that the environmental argument of biodiversity protection was actually the dominant discourses and was mobilized by Dalit leaders to contest caste structures, to contest caste discrimination, to reassert Dalit right to possess land, and to reassert pastoral tradition. But then I also witnessed a complete a huge field of everyday insubordination acts that avoid the written and the public transcript and that take more ambiguous and more dissimulated ways of expression. And this was particularly prevalent in Manvi in cases of long established wind farm, where I was told several times that cable theft, sabotage, destruction of windmills were actually usually happening. And this is typically labeled by Scott as a typical forms of everyday resistance, as an indirect mean to reclaim dispossessed resources and political agency. And in the same context of Manvi, this time in construction area, I also witnessed several times pastoral communities grazing their cattle directly in the vicinity of the construction area. And therefore, we can see that I can say that continuing pastoral practices in a new environment that has been completely redesigned, redrawn, and remodeled by external actors might be interpreted as a form of resistance. So, as a brief conclusion, I would like to reaffirm that renewable development is, in a sense, following resource extraction, but with important specificities that I've tried to point out. Indeed, extraction of renewables is advancing through a process of resource frontier and territorialization as a new resource has been discovered, and where strong governance instruments like knowledge production are being deployed. This extraction model relies on the strengthening of caste structures, of land-owning caste domination and power relation and corruption transaction mediated by brokers, but the domination experiences and the violent dispossession situations caused by green extraction are actually generating incredible new possibilities and political configurations for subordinate communities in terms of political agency and empower. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and please do not hesitate to ask any question you may have. Thanks a lot.